Good day or afternoon, dear colleagues. We are glad to present you the next section of our conference, broadly speaking, on religious identities during the war. Our moderator is Dmitry Uzlane, and I'll give the floor to Dmitry.
Okay, Olga, thank you very much. Well, welcome everyone to our panel on religion and war. Our panel is called Religious Identities During the War. We have 6 presentations, and before we start, I would like to say just a few words. I would like to say that the main idea behind our panel is to reflect on the mutual influence between the war and religion, how the war affects religious institutions, believers, religious identities, and how religion in turn shapes the perception, justification, and even initiation of the war. So the war is going for 3 years, and we have seen a lot of very significant developments in this sphere. And I think that this time frame, it gives us a chance to make some kind of initial conclusions about the role of religion in this war and the role of the war in shaping religious identities and religious dynamics. So I hope we will be able to discuss this broad question from 2 perspectives, from the perspective of how war affects religion, how it shapes self-identification of believers, for example, but on the other hand, how religion influences war, how religious doctrines and theological narratives, how they become the foundation of political theologies, political ideologies that justify the war. I would also like to say that when we were organizing this panel, we decided to take a broader approach. So not to limit our discussion to one single religious organization or one single religious confession or even to one single religion. We decided to involve various religions that are involved in this war. So today we are going to talk about Christianity, about Orthodox Christianity, about Islam, about Buddhism. So in order to give a broader picture of what we are dealing with. And also our other idea was to go beyond the exclusively Russian context. So we wanted to see how this topic manifests itself in other countries that are involved in this war. So we want to bring perspective about Ukraine, but also perspective about Belarus, at least how the issue of Belarus is reflected in the rhetoric of religious actors who are involved in this war. So these are the topics that I hope we will be able to discuss in our panel, and we will continue it on our roundtable and also during our presentation of the book by Vyacheslav Karpov. So thank you for coming, and now I would like to pass the word to our first presenter, to Ksenia Luchenko. Ksenia Luchenko is a journalist, researcher, and analyst. Her focus is Russian Orthodox Church and church-state relations in Russia. She is currently affiliated with the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Sciences in Montenegro, and she is also well known as the author and creator of the Telegram channel Pravoslavie i Zombie. And her presentation is entitled Russian Orthodox Church and the War, What Has Changed After 3 years. So Ksenia, thank you. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dmitry. I'd like to apologize, first of all, because I'm at the airport, so there are some noise and announcements. I'm sorry. And I will ask Dmitry to help me with showing the presentation because it's not easy to to do it from the airport. So let's begin. I think we should move to the second slide, slide number 2, with Putin. Yeah, thank you. When motivating the attack on Ukraine, Vladimir Putin cited the defense of the Russian Orthodox Church and its interests as one of the reasons. On February 21, 2022, in his address to Russians about recognizing the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, he said, I quote, "In Kyiv, preparations continue for a crackdown of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate. This is not an emotional assessment. There are concrete decisions and documents. The tragedy of the church split has cynically been turned into a tool of state policy by the Ukrainian authorities." Next slide, please. In the earliest known document outlining Russia's demands to Ukraine, a leak of a Russian peace treaty project they plan to sign in Istanbul in spring 22, the first of the ideological points was cancel and prevent any restrictions and discrimination against the canonical Orthodox Church, Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, restore all of its rights, including property rights. After this, the status of the Russian language and the ban of Nazi symbolics followed in this document. But the first point from this ideological part was the situation with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. That was one of their conditions to sign this peace treaty document. That never happened. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church itself never appealed to the Russian president for protection. Just as the Revolution of Dignity in 2014 in Kyiv became a key trauma for Putin, the creation of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine became a similar trauma for the head of Russian Orthodox Church, for Patriarch Kirill. If such a thing is possible, it could happen in other parts of the Russian Orthodox Church or even in Russia itself. A shared fear of Ukrainian independence brought the Patriarch and President closer. For both the Kyiv Pечерsk Lavra, for example, the oldest Orthodox monastery in Eastern Europe, symbolizes the Kyiv baptismal font, from which the Patriarch continually draws the unified Orthodox people of Holy Rus, and the President draws the continuous Russian statehood. In his interview to American blogger Tucker Carlson, Putin said, "The centralized Russian state began to form from the moment of the baptism of Rus, when Prince Vladimir accepted Orthodoxy." So Kyiv is a very crucial symbolic place both for Putin and for Patriarch. And that explains this involvement of the Russian Church into this war. Next slide, please. Thank you. On February 24th of 2022, the day the invasion began, the full-scale invasion began, Patriarch Kirill published a short and relatively neutral address to all members of Russian Orthodox Church. Without naming the responsible part for the conflict, he called it conflict, he said he called for helping refugees, avoiding victims among civilians, and praying for peace. In stark contrast, on the same day, the Metropolitan of Kyiv, Onufriy, addressed Putin directly, accusing him of the Cain-like sin of fratricide. Gradually, the pro-war rhetoric in the Russian Orthodox Church grew. In early March, when Russian troops occupied Bucha and Hostomel, and thousands of Ukrainian refugees flooded into Europe, the church calendar marked Forgiveness Sunday at the beginning of the Great Lent, a time for reflection, prayer, and penance. Patriarch Kirill, in a sermon at Church Christ, at Christ the Savior Cathedral, said, "We have entered into a battle that has not physical but metaphysical significance." He argued that certain forces claiming world power demand loyalty through events like pride parades, and that Donbass had resisted these forces for 8 years. A real war was necessary to continue holding them back, these forces. And since this, it is a war against sin that has not only political significance, but also directly relates to the salvation of humanity. This was the first awkward attempt to sacralize the Russian invasion of Ukraine. A week later, the Patriarch solemnly presented an icon of the Mother of God Avgustovskaya, which had appeared to a soldier in World War I, to the head of the Russian National Guard, Viktor Zolotov. "We are moving step by step toward our goal, and victory will be ours, and this icon will protect the Russian military and speed our victory," said Zolotov before the icon was sent to the National Guard's church. Next slide, please. The church is involved in this war on several levels. Aside from direct interaction with the army and presence at the front, there is propaganda and ideological support, mystical support that I call mystical management, and manipulations in foreign policy. Over the 3 years of war, Patriarch Kirill has been included in the sanction lists of the UK, Canada, Lithuania, the Czech Republic, Estonia, Australia, and Ukraine. The European Union excluded him from 2 sanction packages, the 6th and the 15th one, if I'm not mistaken, due to the intervention of Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban. Orban supports Patriarch on the European level and ban the European Union from including him into the sanction lists. Next slide, please. Let's speak about the ideological support, the first point. The film War and Bible, for example, was released in late 2022 and sought to connect all the key points of state propaganda: the atrocities of Ukrainians, immoral NATO countries, an attack was being prepared against us, the cult of the president leader, the image of soldiers as protectors of the downtrodden, etc. And it was sacralizing all these points of state propaganda, relying on the Old Testament and the only Orthodox work, theological, so-called theological work on war, the writings of Serbian saint from the 20th century, Nikolai Velimirovich. The host, chief editor of the Spas channel, Boris Korchevnikov, and priest Igor Fomin visited the occupied territories of Ukraine and read this book, glorifying the war and Putin. The Spas channel belongs to the Moscow Patriarchate and is part of this digital multiplex, a package of mandatory free-to-air channels available throughout Russia. Several similar films have been released. They release such films every several months, in addition to regular shows supporting the war, where Ukrainians are called Ukronazis and Banderovцы, I don't know how to translate. The latest one, God in the War, was aired a few days ago. Next slide, please. But these TV shows and publications on different church media is not the only direction of religious state propaganda. In the fall of 2022, 55,000 Muscovites visited the multimedia exhibition, Ukraine at the Crossroads of Eras. In the Manezh exhibition hall near the Kremlin walls, it was organized by the Patriarchal Council for Culture under Metropolitan Tikhon Shevkunov, following the model of his previous historical exhibitions. The exhibition, spanning 4,000 square meters, used photos, archival documents, posters, maps, interactive panels, and art objects to tell the story of the Ukrainian project, so-called Ukrainian projects, from the 9th century to the destruction of Mariupol, about how Ukraine thrived when united with Russia, and how in various eras traitors, with the help of the West, implanted a harmful idea of independence and sovereignty. Behind this division and conflict, are supranational and infinitively cruel forces from whom it doesn't matter whether they are Afghans, Koreans, or Ukrainians, explained Shevkunov. President Putin visited the opening of this exhibition on National Unity Day, November 4th, and then the exhibition traveled in 15 regions, and there were lines to enter everywhere, with school children brought on excursions. So the Russian Orthodox Church helps the state to conceptualize the war, building a coherent mythological narrative that delegitimizes Ukrainian statehood and explains the need for the violent return of the brotherly people to the fold. Next slide, please. This next level of support of the war by the Russian Orthodox Church. A few days after the announcement of mobilization in September 2022, when thousands of young men stood in long lines at the Russian borders with Georgia and Kazakhstan, and airplane tickets to visa-free countries for Russians had become as expensive as cars, Patriarch Kirill delivered a sermon stating that anyone who dies while performing military duty sacrifices themselves for others. Therefore, we believe that this sacrifice washes away all the sins a person has committed. Thus, those killed in mobilization will be without sin and go straight to heaven. This theological innovation is closest to the Islamic concept of Shahada. But in this case, the Patriarch suggests that Russians die in a war he himself called fratricidal. The next slide. The Russian Orthodox Church has fully supported the mobilization at all levels, showing that it is a godly endeavor. No video photo from military enlistment offices, whether in major cities or remote rural areas, is without a priest sprinkling departing soldiers with holy water, distributing crosses, icons, and gospels, hearing confessions, often giving farewell sermons, blessing them for the defense of the motherland, and performing special prayers. The farewell ceremony for mobilized soldiers quickly became a ritual, creating a new rite of passage. The recruits left for dangerous unknowns, gaining a new social status, and thus it required sacralization and aestheticization. I think next slide will be good. During the war, the superstitions of, well, I will show, these are the how the priests at the front lines baptize people, and I'll tell about it a bit later. And now we'll, I think, switch to the next slide. During the war, the superstitions of Putin and his entourage increased, which led to more instances of using mysticism and sacred artifacts. In mid-April 2023, when Putin first visited the occupied territories of Ukraine, he brought 2 copies of the Savior Not Made by Hands icon, the original of which is housed in the main temple of the armed forces in Kubinka. One was left at the headquarters of the Dnieper Group in the Kherson region, and the second at the headquarters of the East Group in the Lugansk region. A year later, one of these icons was taken on a pilgrimage to various cities. In Chelyabinsk, the Metropolitan held a prayer service before it for granting victory. This artifact, gifted by the president and having been to the front, thus strengthened its sacred significance. In May 2023, this icon of Saint Seraphim of Sarov was flown over territories of Russia as potential risk for enemy drones. On a Rosgvardia plane, accompanied by a priest from the military department of the Moscow Patriarchate, Roman Bagdasarov. This icon in 1904 was used by the Emperor Nicholas II to bless soldiers leaving for the Russian-Japanese War, which was soon lost by Russia. This airborne procession was meant to protect Russian border regions from Ukrainian drones. Such aerial processions with icons over different territories became regular. A few days before this flight, the director of Hermitage Museum, Mikhail Piotrovsky, announced the transfer of the tomb of Alexander Nevsky to the Russian Orthodox Church, noting that today the sacred significance of the monument is more important than its artistic value. This sarcophague of the Holy Prince was located in the relics of Alexander Nevsky were already located in the Alexander Nevsky Lavra, where they have always been venerated and prayed before them. And the Baroque silver tomb weighing more than 100 tons and created during the reign of Empress Elizabeth was kept in the Hermitage. And now, as Petrovsky reported, the union of the relics with the tomb in the Lavra acquires special meaning. From the point of view of Orthodox theology, there is no special meaning in how the relics are decorated. Soon it became clear that the President Putin also ordered the transfer of the most famous Russian icon, Andrei Rublev's Trinity, to the Russian Orthodox Church. The Patriarch, in a letter to the head of the presidential administration, Anton Vaino, requested that the icon should be moved to Christ the Savior Cathedral just for 2 weeks for the holiday of the Trinity. In response, he received it permanently and even from the president himself. The transfer of one of the most precious treasures of Russian culture into the possession of the Russian Orthodox Church by the president is a significant event. For Russian officials, it is typical to have a superstitious, that is, pagan attitude towards object that possesses mystical power. There is a legend that in 1941, Stalin initiated an aerial procession. Either the Kazan or Tikhvin icon of the Mother of God flew over Moscow in an airplane, after which the Battle of Moscow was won. Stalin is often called a secretly devout leader in this legend. Of course, this has nothing to do with historical reality. Putin is not secretly but openly devout and repeats these patterns to win his battles. He gave Trinity before the Ukrainian counteroffensive, and Ukrainians lost it. For the modern Russian Orthodox Church, Trinity is a symbolic capital, a part of its symbolic capital. The fact that the clergy managed to take it, breaking the long-standing resistance of the museum community through force, is a sign of power and a claim to a monopoly on the production of miracles. Miracles are now especially expected from the Orthodox Church, as always happens in troubled times. Moreover, it is a success of the strategy of unconditional support for the war. The purpose of transferring Trinity to the Russian Orthodox Church was precisely to put it in its place. Mystical historicity, the para-religious cult of the past, outweighed rational arguments, as if there is an instruction for the resurrection of Holy Rus, where one must capture Ukraine and place Trinity in the iconostasis, to do as it was in mythical times to make it return. Now Trinity stands exactly where it was before 1904, almost out of sight, lit by the dim light of lamps and candles. They made a special display case with armored glass for it after more than a year of wandering through various rooms without proper equipment. The next slide, please. The use of the Russian Orthodox Church for foreign policy dates back to the very foundation of the Moscow Patriarchate with Stalin. Even then, tasks for intelligence, diplomacy, and creating a positive image of the ROK abroad were set before the hierarchy. Several directions of this work became apparent during this war. Ongoing relations with the Vatican, travel and negotiations. Participation in the World Council of Churches. It's a very important platform for manipulating anti-Western sentiments in the global South. At the assembly in Karlsruhe in May 22, the Russian Church delegation was able to present its views on the war in Ukraine and the religious situation in Ukraine. A delegation from the World Council of Churches visited Russia, met with Patriarch Kirill, and expressed solidarity with him in the search for peace. And these contacts remain ongoing. We can show the next slide, I think. There are some illustrations. In March 2024, the World Russian People Council, which is headed by Patriarch Kirill, but formally it's not a church organization, but however it is headed by Patriarch Kirill, adopted a document called Nakaz. Its status is not entirely clear, but the text is published on the official website of the Moscow Patriarchate and represents an attempt to formulate a state ideology. Special military operation is defined in it as a holy war against the criminal Kiev regime and collective West behind it. An entire section is devoted to the Russian world, the borders of which, as a spiritual and cultural civilizational phenomenon, are significantly wider than the state borders of both the current Russian Federation and large historical Russia. In other words, the scale of expansion is not limited by anything. The foreign policy section explicitly asserts that the Ukrainians and Belarusians are sub-ethnoses of the Russian one. Many countries reacted strongly to the appearance of this document. The World Council of Churches, the largest ecumenical organization uniting 352 Christian churches from more than 100 countries, called the thesis of this Nakaz incompatible with the biblical call to Christians to be peacemakers in the midst of conflict. Next slide, please.
Ksenia, you have 1 minute.
Yes, I will finish in 1 minute. Scandals include the expulsion of the Russian priest representing the Russian Patriarchate in Bulgaria for espionage, the activities of the Moscow Patriarchate in Africa with Prigozhin and Russian campaigns, and the revelation by the FBI of an Orthodox spy in America. A strange story concerns Russia's transfer of Ukrainian prisoners of war to Hungary through the mediation of the Russian Orthodox Church. And there is also one priest expelled from Czech Republic, also for spying in Russia's interests. And there are some more topics about the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and so on, but it will take too long to explain. And the main that I wanted to underline that if we believe into official data that 2,000 priests, official data distributed by Moscow Patriarchate, that 2,000 priests were on the front lines with the soldiers, then we should admit that every 20th Orthodox priest visited the war. Well, he was participating in the war. We have 36,000 of priests, and from these 36,000, 2,000 were actively involved in the war on the front lines. I think that's a huge amount. That's all that I wanted to say. Thank you very much, Dmitry, for helping me.
Thank you, Ksenia, for your very interesting presentation. So we have a few minutes for questions, unfortunately only a few minutes. So if you have questions, I mean listeners, you can address this question to the technical moderator of the conference, Noy Adamov, and then they will all be wired to the presenter. Okay, I will start with the question. Ksenia, do you see any dynamics? I mean, is it just these relations between the church and the war? Is it some kind of continuity, or we can see some changes over these 3 years?
I don't think that changes are significant, but in the beginning it was rather chaotic. And now there is a system in supporting the war because and everyone is involved, from the parishioners that help the front with collecting money and donations, sending to the front, even cars, and the children in Sunday schools writing postcards to our brave soldiers and so on, reading this mandatory prayer for the victory of the Holy Rus. And this is the level of parishes. Then there is this department of relations with the armed forces that is headed by Metropolitan Kirill of Stavropol. He was, Petrov changed the head of this department during the war. And this figure of Metropolitan Kirill, who was supporting Cossacks for years, he was responsible with the relations with Cossacks. So these paramilitary and very patriotic organizations. And with this experience, he was invited to head the whole department responsible for the whole church army relations. And he's trying to force the Ministry of Defense to hire more priests at an official level as chaplains, and to give them all the the salaries and the I forgot the word, how we call it, льготы, like benefits, like for the contract soldiers. And but the Minister of Defense refuses to do it for more than 2 years. And even Andrei Belousov, who is Orthodox, and everyone expected when he was he became the minister that now the church will have a green light, but there is no green light still since then. But however, they sent priests to the front lines, and they ask more and more priests from the diocese to participate in this. So I think it is straightened. This support of the war on all the levels is straightening, and more systematic than in the beginning.
Okay. Yes. Thank you. So we have time for one more small question. Is there any question to Ksenia? It's time to move to our second presenter, to Alicia Churanovich. Alicia Churanovich is Associate Professor in the Faculty of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Warsaw, and she is author of several books. The book, The Religious Factor in Russia's Foreign Policy, Keeping God on Our Side. The book was published in 2012. And also the book, The Sense of Mission in Russian Foreign Policy, Destined for Greatness. It's a book from 2021. And the academic interests of Alicia are ontological security, messianism, and the religious factor in foreign policy, Russia's foreign policy, and international relations in the post-Soviet area and in Central Europe. And Professor Jovanovic will talk today about Belarus and Belarusians in the narratives of the Russian Orthodox Church after 2022. So, Alicia, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. I apologize in advance. I don't have a presentation, so you have to bear with my face on the screen. I hope you can do it. I'll try to be brief. And I apologize in advance because I just discovered my neighbor decided to do some renovations in an apartment next door, so I hope it won't be too much of a trouble and we'll survive it. So, I mean, I think from the presentation of Ksenia Luchenko, it's pretty clear. We got the big picture and the detailed picture as well, how much the Russian Orthodox Church is engaged in legitimizing this war. And of course, because of the war, all eyes are on Ukraine. But this conflict, which is already, has been lasting for 3 years, it affects also the situation of Orthodoxy in Belarus, right? And also, of course, the situation of Orthodox church structures in Belarus is different from what we had in Ukraine, even before the invasion, right? For starters, Belarusian Orthodox Church was not autonomous, but exarchat, so it's autonomous within the Russian Orthodox Church was much more limited than the one of Ukrainian Orthodox Church. The second, there are no other competitive Orthodox churches in Belarus, which could undermine this dominant position of Belarus Orthodox Church. So in this way, it's easier, right, than in Ukraine. And finally, something very important from the point of view of Moscow Patriarchate is the fact that, well, the hierarchy of Belarusian Orthodox Church has never really sought autocephaly or raised it as an issue which should be addressed, and something should be done about it. So, of course, this is a very big difference between Ukraine and Belarus. And last but not least, despite all the zigzags in Lukashenko's policy, those two parties, so Belarusian Orthodox Church and Lukashenko's regime, they have managed to create a functional working kind of relationship. Maybe not cordial one. Lukashenko is known to be kind of anti-clerical, if you could say so, right? Orthodox atheists and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, it's functioning, right? It's a functioning relationship between two parties in one country. The moment of trial for the Belarusian Orthodox Church came before the invasion. That's, of course, the protests in Belarus, the Belarusian Revolution of 2020. And again, despite the tensions and problems which were there, I mean, just as an example, to give the fact that the Metropolitan Pavel was replaced with Metropolitan Veniamin and other changes, the Belarusian Orthodox Church, survived the revolution, the protests, and when the invasion started again, there were some, differences. We have a hawkish group, we have more centered group, but in general, the Belarusian Orthodox Church conveys the impression of stability, right? That the things are stable and under control. But I would argue here that, in fact, the change is taking place, and this is the change which is taking place on the side of the Russian Orthodox Church. And I set myself a simple goal. I wanted to see how the invasion influenced how Belarusians as a nation and Belarus as a state are narrated in the official discourse of the Moscow Patriarchate. So between, let's say, February 2020 and fall of 2024, I analyzed the available documents on the official websites of both the Russian Orthodox Church, Belarusian Orthodox Church, and also World Russian People's Council, right? And in particular, I wanted to see how the fact that with the war in Ukraine, the narrative about true nation really got radicalized, how it affects the status of Belarusians as a nation. So I am saying that the change is taking place, but if I am to say that the change is taking place, of course, I have to also give you the picture of how it was then before the invasion. And if we even go really far, so to the 90s, right, the image of Belarus in Russian discourse, not only the church discourse, but in Russian discourse as such, was, of course, positive, especially that it's usually compared with Ukraine. So the Belarus is the most reliable ally, and the Belarusians are the exemplary brotherly nation on which you can always rely, while Ukrainians are the troublemakers, right? And this kind of bad and good cup, you could say this was a clearly, I mean, this model was really working here. And as Kaczarski and Kubova pointed, you know, this positive image of Belarus came also with certain simplification. I mean, this kind of taking Belarus for granted that it's anyway pro-Russian, right, resulted in the fact that expertise on Belarus was much less developed than the one on Ukraine. Plus, there was a kind of tendency to romanticize Belarus as this kind of, you know, okay, a bit backward, but countryside where good things are still good there, that they still have those good food products, and this kind of a bit idyllic picture, right? So, I mean, a seminal work which took focus on how Belarus and Belarusians were narrated in Russian official discourse. So how the Russian elite and the Russian state portrayed these two entities. This research was done by Jan Klimke in 2008. He published an article where he said, you know, if you thought that the relationship between Russia and Belarus is all about paternalistic kind of structure, you're wrong, because in fact there are three narratives which can be used or which are present in how Russian elite and Russian state interpret or present Belarus and Belarusians. He said these are three, so fraternity, parasitism, and paternality. And the dominant one, and this is already the end of the second presidential term of Putin, right? The dominant one was fraternity. Fraternity emphasized the equality of two sovereign nations. So Belarus and Russia, these are two sovereign states. Of course, they are close because of history, culture, faith, right? But these are friendly, separate nations and states, and the fact that they have a union state, that's a success. Parasitism, which was the second most popular in the mid-2000s, also, approached Belarus as an economic burden for Russia, and so thought that the union state is a costly failure. It's a costly mistake because Russia doesn't need to pay for Belarus because, you know, where they will go, right? And finally, paternalism, which probably, common sense would tell us that this should be the most popular one. This was the least popular among those narratives. It did send a message that, you know, Belarus sovereignty is not a full sovereignty, that it's somehow limited, but nevertheless, it did recognize that, you know, that existence of Belarus state is a fact. It happened as a result of, you know, 1991 changes, and that's it, right? So this has happened. We are living now with an independent state of Belarus, but we know that, you know, this in fact like more a buffer state or a weak state which Russia should take care of or help or support. So sovereign, but not fully. And if the concept of true nation would appear, it would within this paternalistic narrative, but it would be very moderate, implicit, and really not that often. Klimke even wrote that you would have to, you know, excavate it like archaeologists because it was so much hidden under other layers, right? And you could say, okay, it's 2008, what do we care about? It was so long time ago, but there was a repetition of this kind of research on the discourse on Russian elite, on Belarus and Belarusians in 2021 by Michał Słowikowski. And it was done, hence, already after the protests, right? And he came to the same conclusion, so that those three narratives were still present in how Russian ruling elite would approach relations with Belarus. So fraternity, parasitism, and paternalism, right? Maybe paternalism getting a bit more present, but still those three would be there. Now, when you think about the narrative of the Russian Orthodox Church, it differed from the state one because it had just two of those three narratives. It had fraternity and paternalism. And until the invasion, fraternity would mean in the 90s, in the first decades of, let's say 15 of the, 15 years of 2000s, right? Fraternity was the dominant one. And paternalism was, of course, present, but it was the second option, and it was really implicit. I mean, the main idea was that, of course, emphasizing the fact that Belarus and Russians, they come of this act of baptism of Rus, right? So they share culture, language, common history. So they do create a community, but it's a spiritual community. This is a community of one faith, one church, right? Hence, there is no need for those two to have a, one political organism. They can easily preserve the spiritual community by Belarusians living in their own state and Russians living in their own state. This wasn't an issue. I mean, what's more, before the invasion, those, this kind of references to triune nation, that in fact, Belarus, Ukrainians, and Russians are one nation, they could be either silently dismissed or even openly rebuffed by the representatives of the Belarusian Orthodox Church. So we have a case of Metropolitan Pavel, who, when he was approached, whether he would agree that Belarusians and Russians are in fact one nation. So in fact, there is no such nation as Belarusians, все русские. He said he dodged it diplomatically, saying, well, in fact, it's irrelevant because we're all children of God. That's the most important part for the church, not nationality. But already Sergei Lapin, who was the spokesman of the church, he openly rejected this idea, that this is one nation and so we should have one state. He even used the notion of Belarus Anschluss, and he rejected it. He said that he loves Russia. He's for unity of the church. So for the idea of spiritual community, absolutely. And this was the way he interpreted Ruski Mir. But this doesn't mean that the Belarusians cannot have their own state. That you can love, and you identify with the spiritual community provided by the church, but you don't have to, be in one political entity. That doesn't have to go, in one package, right? So he was clear about it. It was 2018, yeah? Because if you think about Belarus before the invasion, right? From the perspective of the Moscow Patriarchate in post-Soviet space, this is really a safe haven. Okay, society is the least religious, probably, among Soviet societies, so it's different than Ukraine this way. And of course, Belarus is not what Ukraine was, so the cradle of, let's say, Kievan Orthodoxy, how it was framed, right? But what it was for a long time presented by Moscow Patriarchate as a country of exemplary cooperation between the government and the Orthodox Church. Right, and the point was here, of course, the agreement on cooperation signed in 2003 between Belarusian Orthodox Church and Lukashenko's government. It was very often the beginning referred to as Concordat. And first Patriarch Alexei and then Patriarch Kirill, he said that, this is ideal framework. They were really proud about it, and they wanted this later to be repeated also in Russia or other post-Soviet countries. This should be the mode of regulating state-church relations, right? So things changed later with Russia, with the conservative turn, and this really close rapprochement between the church and the state. But before, the early 2000s, really, Belarus looks like a good place to cooperate for the Orthodox Church. So in a way, Belarus was a case which said that, the Russian Orthodox Church, the Moscow Patriarchate, really doesn't have to push for territorial reintegration of post-Soviet space, because it can still preserve integrity of its canonical territory by dealing with each former Soviet republic individually, and even have advantage in this if the local government is weaker or needs Russian Orthodox Church for something, right? So this was an example of that. You can do it differently than just pushing for kind of a new imperial reintegration. And I mean, from the point of view of Russian Orthodox Church, the key thing was that really, in terms of Belarus, you didn't have a serious push, official one for autocephaly, right? This was never raised, is that now we want it and we'll talk about it and we'll demand it. So they could really feel secure. In fact, you know, this kind of autocephaly started to be labeled as Ukrainian scenario, as something which you should be afraid of, and something you should be afraid because you don't want to destroy the spiritual community of, you know, Belarusian and Russian nations, right? And just for a moment, because this Ukraine scenario or Ukrainian lesson, this was really something, I don't know if formative, but definitely important for all three parties involved in this situation. So for Lukashenko, Belarusian Orthodox Church, and the Moscow Patriarchate, because especially after annexation of Crimea, these three parties draw a kind of different conclusions. So Belarusian Orthodox Church understood that it's not good to be straightforward identified as Russian Church, right? This might end badly, right? Then we have Moscow Patriarchate, which understood that it's not good if your local church, so Belarusian Orthodox Church, is identified in a straightforward way with the local government. You don't want to have another Yanukovych church. That's not good. It's better to keep more distant from it, right? And thirdly, it was like Lukashenko who understood that to have a too pro-Russian church might be a liability when the push comes to shove to his government, to his power, right? So, you know, Ukrainian scenario worked on each party's mind, we could say in this way. So, okay, we had protests, the church survived it, the war came, and apart from the, let's say, Artemy of Grodno, who criticized it and he was dismissed, and individual priests who criticized it and also were kind of, they made sanctions, more or less the church, the official church, tried to keep this kind of profile, we are for peace. And we, there's also a hawkish party, let's say, but let's be for peace and let's keep a low profile in this, right? So from the Belarusian Orthodox Change Point kind of position, we are stable, right? Now, and I said in the beginning that but the things are changing, but on the side of the Moscow Patriarchate, despite the fact that, you know, Belarus is this kind of still safe haven, even if you think about the protests, they were an anti-Russian. This was a color, if you call it color revolution within this scheme, there were no anti-Russian slogans, right? So a completely different situation than what they could, you know, be concerned with when it comes to Ukraine, right? So how the narrative changed. So if you take and you see, I mean, how these two, fraternity and paternalism, changed after the invasion. Of course, paternalism got stronger at the expense of, at the cost of fraternity, right? In fact, fraternity is not anymore there. It's paternalism, and it has two kind of versions. There is a moderate one and a radical one. And the moderate one, this is the one usually presented by top hierarchs of the Moscow Patriarchate, including Patriarch Kirill, which still does the lip service and says, we really appreciate that Belarusians are this brotherly nation on whom we can rely, and we can always, you know, they always have our back. So in a way, implicitly, he does recognize that there is something like Belarusian nation. And he's happy that there is a union state. But what's new here is this overtone, which wasn't so present before, that more and more often Patriarch and other hierarchs says, yes, so that's the brotherly nation, and we are all together a part of something bigger, which is historical Rus. And it's such a shame, you know, that this historical Rus cannot be reintegrated again. You have statements by Patriarch Kirill when he says, you know, the Soviet Union, yes, this was a state with many issues. And of course, we understand, like, you know, forced atheization policy, repression of people, of believers, and so on and so forth. So he had many problems. But one thing, at least it was good, it kept integral the space of historical Rus. And with more and more such statements, there is a message delivered that, you know, the fall of the Soviet Union was a colossal mistake. The independence of post-Soviet republics, it's a deplorable mistake. So we recognize there are Belarusians, but in fact their statehood is a mistake. It's a historical mistake, and the best would be to reunite historical Rus again, right? And in the radical version, which is presented by the World Russian People Council, the gloves are off. You know, it's not even paternalism, because paternalism it assumes that you have a father figure, okay, and a parent. I mean, father. You have a parent, let's say, a parent and a kid, right? And the parent is, of course, in this kind of superior position and can tell the kid what it needs, what it wants. So there is a symmetry, there's hierarchy, right? The kid is limited in its sovereignty, if we can say so. But nevertheless, the kid is there. In this radical version, in fact, the kid is not there anymore. In fact, it's not paternalism, but it's infanticide, right? It's the parent which aims to kill, to get rid of the kid, because Belarusian nation as such, it doesn't exist, right? Все русские, it's trio nation concept all the way. And in the documents which were adopted by the council, you really get radical postulates, like the doctrine of trio nation should get a legal base. The fact that, you know, sovereign Belarus or Ukraine exists, this is just an artificial doctrine created and promoted by our enemies. Those who undermine the trio nation concept should be sanctioned. This shouldn't be allowed, and so on and so forth. And of course, that there is the fact that there is one trio nation which lives in different countries should be repaired by redrawing the borders and territorial integrity of those countries again with Russia. So something which was for so many years presented as spiritual community, where it's enough that we have one church, but many countries. So this kind of initial idea of Alexei how to approach the fall of the Soviet Union, this logic is off, right? Now it's not enough. This is not just spiritual community. This is one nation which should live in one state, right? And this should be something where Russian policy should head, right? So that's the radical. So I'm concluding here. If you think about it, I mean, for so many years, Belarus was the good kid, right? It was not a troublemaker, unlike Ukraine, right? And nevertheless, although, okay, it's not invaded by Russia, but nevertheless, within this narrative, it's doomed to share destiny of Ukrainians. It is Belarusians are to dissolve in this big community of Ruski Narod. That's it, right? Them, I mean, Belarusians and their state, they should simply come back to historical Russia and the Russian nation, right? And if you think about it, well, this, I mean, Russian Orthodox Church had really a good deal, if we could say so, in Belarus, right? But the invasion, so coming back, I mean, to the question which Dmitry raised in the beginning, but the invasion changed the framework. The narrative also changes the logic, right? It's not enough. The spiritual community is not enough, you know, and the territorial revisionism is something what we declare, what is deemed in this narrative necessary to, you know, to fulfill this kind of brotherly communion. Okay, I hope you bear with me. Thank you so much. I look forward to comments and questions. Well, still here.
Thank you. Thank you, Alicia. So we have some time for questions. Please write questions to conference moderator. Okay, I will start with the first question. Well, my question will be similar to the question that I asked the previous presenter about the perspectives of peace. Do you think that Belarusian Church and Belarus can play some role in the peace process?
Well, in the peace process as such, I mean, the one we think which is between political parties, I don't think so. But if if you take the first presentation, yeah, by Ksenia, where she showed that in this leaked kind of peace idea, the status of the church is going to be an issue of peace talks, or could be an issue of peace talks, right? Restoring the status of the Russian Orthodox Church, right? Something that will be addressed. Well, maybe then potentially, right, this kind of Belarusian Orthodox Church who could try to, I don't know, facilitate or be a broker or facilitate the meeting or conversation between the two churches, right? Although, of course, this can be problematic, but I mean, if you ask for a chance, this could be maybe a chance. Because when the invasion started, right, and we know that the Belarus is not officially a part of the conflict, but it's a kind of unwilling contributor, right? It provided territory, the Russian bases are there, they used it to attack, right? So this we know. So there was a moment when representatives of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, they sent an appeal to the Belarusian Orthodox Church asking for solidarity, right? Kind of condemnation of the war. This didn't happen. We had just this stand for peace. But if you think about the reaction, right? So you do expect kind of solidarity from the Belarusian Orthodox Church, thinking we are in a similar boat. This could be maybe an argument why, or open a possibility for the Belarusian Orthodox Church to, yeah, to be the broker, at least to facilitate a meeting or some kind of phase of those meetings between Moscow Patriarchate and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. But it's a speculation, of course.
Okay, thank you for your answer. And one more question. You mentioned that we see kind of radicalization of this paternalist narrative. And do you see any counter reaction from the Belarusian side? Do they react somehow, the contra narratives?
Great, thank you. I forgot to mention this. So you have this hawkish party, right? It's like Andrei Lemishonka, Alexandru Manchuk, who embrace Ruski Mir, true nation concept. This is it. This is how we thought about it from the start. So hooray, right? But even if you, and of course, I mean, open kind of rebuffing as what was possible in 2018 is not there anymore, right? But if you think, for example, even about the statements of Metropolitan Veniamin, I would say that he still desperately tries to, you know, he tries not to allow the spiritual community idea to die completely. So whenever he addresses, you know, the issue, he talks about two brotherly nations or three brotherly nations in a spiritual community, and not going into this, you know, that territorial integrity would be something I would like to see. And of course, why he's keeping this position, he has to consider Lukashenko's stand. That so this is completely understand, right? He's between the two poles, the Moscow Patriarchate and the regime in the country, the church he leads, right? But nevertheless, he wasn't the one to jump on this wagon, like, yeah, this is it. So he tries to balance. But of course, it's not an easy task, right? But this idea that the best if it can stay spiritual, it's there in his statements.
Okay, thank you, Alicia, for your answers, and thank you for a wonderful presentation. And
thank you so much.
If there will be more questions to Alicia, you can send them to chat and I will hand them to Alicia. And now it's time to move to our next speaker, to our next presentation, to Bozhidar Kolov. Bozhidar Kolov is a lecturer in Russian history at the Arctic University of Norway in Tromsø, and an expert on the political theology of the Russian Orthodox Church. He has recently published on ecclesiastical populism in contemporary Russia, and also on the religious component in contemporary Russian imperialism. And Bozhidar is going to talk today about militarism and orthodoxy at the World Russian People's Council, national and regional dimensions. So Bozhidar, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dimitri. Just let me know if my slides are all right or my audio as well. So I'm gonna talk today about the Russian People's Council. And we've all heard and read this statement, and I understand there's quite a lot of outrage there, but my job here is going to be about unpacking the concept of holy war within the framework of the World Russian People's Council. And this is part of a paper that I'm writing with the supervisor of my PhD dissertation, Paul Coastal, but I'm also going to build on several of already published works. So to begin with, a few words about the Council itself. And I'm grateful here to all the previous speakers, to Ksenia, Glunas, and Alicia, to partially introduce the Council so my job is easier. So as already mentioned, the Council is chaired by the Moscow Patriarch, first by Alexei, and then after 2009 by Kirill. The meetings are held in the headquarters of the Russian Orthodox Church, the Danilov Monastery, also after the year 2000 in the Cathedral of Christ the Savior. And in the last several years, there have been several councils in the State Kremlin Palace, which used to host the congresses of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The declarations, at least in the past 15 years or so, of the Council have been published on the Patriarchate official website, and this organization is also represented at the UN, the Council for Cultural and Economic Affairs, if I remember correctly, and that is since 2005, so for quite a while now. The annual assemblies are attended by state officials, religious and political leaders from different religious organizations and political parties, and also by conservative public intellectuals. They've been instrumental since the very beginning. These public figures that try to articulate already in the 1990s a certain vision of reconstruction of Russia, revival of Russia, and so on. We're going to talk about this a little bit later. And since my presentation is not only about the Central Council, the one that is held in Moscow, but also about the regional chapters, the regional forums that are held, I should mention that there are already 70 regional chapters in many of the subjects of the regional subjects of the Russian Federation. And just to give you kind of an impression of the atmosphere, this is from the hall of assemblies in the Cathedral of Christ the Savior. You can see the kind of symbolic ambience with the Patriarch in the center and multiple politicians and public intellectuals around him. And as I already mentioned, you have religious figures from other traditional religions attending, public intellectuals such as Alexander Dugin, the Orthodox entrepreneur / ideologue Alexander Malofeev, who was Konstantin Malofeev, who was a deputy head of the council between 2019 and 2024. And you can see here also the leader of the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. So this is a kind of a historical bloc, an alliance, a coalition that has been there almost since the beginning, including patriotic organizations and paramilitary formations such as Sorok, for instance, as you can see on this picture. And of course, the political leadership of the country is also present. President Putin has been attending these councils already from the beginning of his presidency 25 years ago. So just to show you a kind of a map of the regional forums that have been held in the last 3 years since the beginning of the war, we have 21 regional forums in 12 subjects of the Russian Federation, plus occupied territories such as Luhansk and Sevastopol. And the key topics that these regional forums cover are, of course, traditional values, family and demography. The forum in Kemerovo kind of specialized in this. They held 3 councils, 3 forums on family and demography. St. Petersburg has specialized in ideology and patriotism, and the topics that have been covered in the occupied territories are, of course, the Russian world. Stavropol, as Ksenia already mentioned, has a metropolitan who serves as the head of the Synodal Department for Cooperation with the Armed Forces. And logically, the forum in Stavropol was engaged with topics such as the military service, such as loyalty to the state, and the first council they held already in December 2022 was called Holy War. So this is actually where the concept was devised much earlier than the Nakaz in 2024. So I'm going to unpack this concept through a genealogy of its articulation within these forums held in Stavropol, but also in Luhansk and Sevastopol. So these are going to be the main topoi of analysis. Just to elaborate a little bit more on the kind of people that attend the councils, you have metropolitan bishops who are usually hosting them, just like the Patriarch is hosting the Central Council. In Moscow, you have governors, you have local academics and artists, national public intellectuals. So Dugin is often traveling to different regions to give speeches. You have Duma representatives from both local Dumas and from the Duma of the Russian Federation, as well as guests from the People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. Religious leaders are attending when available, when there are such in the given regions, as well as local branches of the civil society organizations that have national coverage. And you can see here a little bit of the atmosphere in the local forums. They're not as magnificent as the one in Moscow, but still have a rather sophisticated event management and aesthetics, and they're often broadcasted on different YouTube channels, national televisions such as Soyuz, and they're covered by local media as well. So these are not marginal events; they're rather a big deal when they happen in the provinces. And in many respects, in the past 3 years, the regional forums look like a tour of Konstantin Malofeev. He has been traveling to most of these councils, meeting with civil society organizations such as the Double-Headed Eagle, as you can see here, or with heads of republics or oblasts, such as the head of the Komi Republic, as you can see on the picture here. And on this slide, you can see the kind of sponsors or the organizations that cooperate, for instance, with the forum in Chelyabinsk. This is from their official website. And you can see here the Union of Orthodox Women, the Imperial Orthodox Palestine Society, the organization of Malofeev himself, Tsarigrad, and the Cossack organizations. So this is the kind of coalition that has been behind these regional forums. So to leave the background aside and to get to the analysis, what I'm going to do is something that I first tried in a book chapter in an edited volume edited by Helge Blackesrud and Paul Costo. And this is an approach called critical explanation, which is devised by David Haworth and Jason Glyness. And what this approach does is something rather simple in structure and a little bit more complicated in content, but it is basically an analysis in 3 steps. First step is analysis of articulation. So what kind of representation of reality has been constructed? So in our case, we're going to talk about holy war. How is holy war articulated? What kind of signifiers have been connected with this concept? The second step is power. So how has this representation come into being? What is the history? What are the power acts that have enabled this historically? And the third step is fantasy. So this is this third step is trying to answer the question, why is this representation of reality gripping the subjects of its articulation? Why does it stick? Why does it matter? So this is rather the affective dimension, or the dimension of identification. So in my analysis, of course, I'm not going to study the reception of the holy war concept. I don't have access to such data, but I can still speak about how the concept of holy war emerged effectively within the Russian elites and the political and spiritual, intellectual elites. So a little bit of prehistory. These are statements not uttered during the council, but before, during the regional councils, but before. So the first approximation to the holy war concept is the metaphysical struggle that we've already covered. This is from March 2022, just several weeks after the full-scale invasion. Then, as Gulnazka mentioned, we have an articulation of the holy war by the Mufti of the Luhansk People's Republic, already in March 2022. And Alexander Shipkov, who is the deputy head of the World Russian People's Council, articulated a concept of theological warfare, by which he meant the so-called de-Russification of Ukraine through the delegitimation of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. So these are concepts that have somehow approximated the articulation of holy war within the framework of the council. And the first one to actually articulate it within the framework of the council was Konstantin Malofeev. In the beginning of December 2022, he said that 2 estates, Saslovia, that serve the country to death should be put on a pedestal. And these are the military and the priests. So he kind of merged these 2 estates into one, the priests and the military, to produce this concept of holy war. So at this point, it is not really elaborated, but it's just a kind of initial articulation of the concept. What is more interesting, however, is how on the forum in Stavropol, which I mentioned, it was headed by Metropolitan Kirill Pakrovsky, the head of the Synodal Department of Cooperation with the Armed Forces. At this council, we had the so-called foreign minister of the Luhansk People's Republic, who said that the special military operation is just one part of holy war. Then one member of the Russian Duma, Olga Kazakova, said that the holy war is a necessity, something that Russia should undertake. And this war is about values, about culture, about traditions, about faith. And these have to be protected to preserve the Russian people as a nation and as a country. So you have here like an external actor who is now a senator, as far as I'm aware, in the Federation Council, that elaborated a little bit more on what holy means in this concept. So it is about culture, tradition, and faith. components that have been already articulated by Patriarch Kirill and have been there for a very, very long time, much before the war. So all the elements of this discourse have existed for years before the full-scale invasion and even before the annexation of Crimea and the war in eastern Ukraine. And Metropolitan Kirill actually had a little bit nuanced statement in December 2022 when he said that the Holy War, it's not a concept that should apply to the special military operation, but nonetheless, it is the operation that kind of triggered this larger discussion about the war in which Russia is. And he elaborated on that, stating that in Ukraine, Russia is fighting with Nazism and Satanism, with the Antichrist. These are images that have that are going to be much more elaborated by Patriarch Kirill in the next 2 years. So you can see here that the regions are not necessarily just receiving some discourse from the center, but rather give ideas and try to bring up certain concepts for which the central discourse can later use. And you can see this by the discourse of Alexander Dugin at the Luhansk Council in May 2023, in which he presented a rather long, I would say, paper, almost philosophical work, as he often does, in which he constructed a rather I wouldn't say sophisticated, but a little bit more complicated narrative around the spiritual warfare, in which he distinguishes between the vertical warfare, which is the metaphysical struggle between angels and demons, and the horizontal one, which is the war between nations, the war between different civilizations, religions, and whatnot. So in the concept of a holy war, he said that these two dimensions merged, the vertical and the horizontal. And that's why this is a war that is more sacred than any of the wars that Russia has waged in its history. So this is the kind of discourse that emerged later in the resolution of the Luhansk Regional Council, of the forum in Luhansk, which precedes the nakaz of March 2024 by almost a year. And you can see here that all the major elements of the nakaz have already been constructed in the resolution of the Luhansk Regional Council. The spiritual space of Holy Rus, the mission of the Katechon, a topic that Alicia has been working extensively on, the image of the West that has fallen into Satanism, and the very mission that Russia has for the whole world, indeed for the all mankind. And all these elements, however, have a history. And they haven't emerged in 2022 or 2023. These major elements, these key narratives about Russia's role in the world, Russia's identity, such as the extra-historical great powerness, this mission that Russia has beyond the history of the world, indeed in eschatological dimension, the ahistorical space that all the territories that have been once governed by Russia in all its shapes and forms are still eternally, ahistorically, a Russian space. and a Russian land. And the idea of the transhistorical people, that once they've emerged after the baptism of Rus, they remain the same. They're a primordial core of one people of Rus. All these ideas represent Ukraine as the mythological birthplace of the Russian state and people, indeed, of Holy Rus. And without Ukraine, the very purpose of Russia, its eschatological purpose cannot be achieved. So Ukraine is a sine qua non for the very ontological identity of Russia. And to analyze the history of these ideas, I've used another theoretical and conceptual framework that I've developed in another book chapter, edited by two Nadias, as you can see on the slide. And in this chapter, I used the concept of hegemony as elaborated by Antonio Gramsci. And the concept is too difficult, perhaps, to explain in such a short time, but its key elements are actually rather simple. So if we take the World Russian People's Council from its beginnings in the early 1990s, we can see that it served as a platform for building an Orthodox great power nationalist alliance. So hegemony starts with a coalition building practice. So the council served this purpose, to build a coalition. And by 2012, when the conservative turn kind of happened, this historical bloc, this formed alliance, achieved hegemony in Russia and embarked on a quest for intellectual and moral leadership in the so-called Russian world. And we could say that they even embarked on a global hegemonic project, presented as a counter-hegemonic project to the global liberalism, secularism, and so on. That is more or less the topic that Dimitri and Christina, who are going to present later, have analyzed in their Traditionalist International. So we have several layers of hegemony in Russia itself, in the Russian world, and in a global scale. And by 2022, due to the failure of the project in Ukraine, this Russian integral state, another Gramscian concept for the merging of the oppressive apparatus of the state and civil society. So this Russian integral state shifted from a war of position, a war of ideology, to a war of maneuver, a physical war, a kinetic war. But nonetheless, the war of position, the ideological war, was not forgotten, and it continues with full speed in the World Russian People's Council. So, but the shift now is, since 2022, is much more significantly on the kinetic part of the conflict. So, to show you how the Russian World People's Council has elaborated these ideas already by the early 1990s, I'm showing you two rather long excerpts from the collective statements of the Council. So bear in mind that these were approved by Patriarch Alexei as the head of the Council. So already by 1993, you have a narrative of Russia as a great power that has to be restored. There is a talk about the geopolitical redistribution of the Russian space, as they call it, areal. So this is the language of the Council that has persisted throughout the years for more than 3 decades. And many of these elements we can see still today, such as the historical unity of the three brotherly peoples, and as it's always in the ecclesiastical and the constitutional discourse, by history, they mean the history of the state. So history is always related to the history of the political history of Russia as they see it, from Kiev to Moscow. And Alicia already spoke about the spiritual tradition as something that could be articulated in opposition to political unity, spiritual unity versus political unity. But I'm afraid that even that concept has been hijacked and co-opted by the great power nationalist discourse, because by spiritual tradition, they mean ideological tradition, a kind of hegemonic consensus among the Belarusians, the Russians, and the Ukrainians. And you can see here also that by 1995, the concept of the Kievan Baptismal Font is already in circulation. Of course, it didn't originate in the World Russian People's Council, but this is a very high platform from which it was articulated.
Zhidar, you have a few minutes.
3 minutes, right? Okay, so I'm gonna skip all the quotes that show how this discourse even reached the highs of Russian politics in the discourse of the president and the legislation from the Duma. But as you probably all have seen, Putin is fully on board now with many of the theological, in quotation marks, justifications of the war, such as Satanism, the idea that Russia is governed by God and that the war was something that God wanted. So I'll try in 2 minutes to show you the last slide about the effective dimension of the Holy War. And this is a war of Holy Rus, essentially. So there's nothing new here. It is defense. The war is a defense of Holy Rus, a concept that has been elaborated for many years now. And the first one is quite obvious, ressentiment, a post-colonial indignation. Russia as a subaltern empire. It has been colonized by the West in the 1990s, but also imperial revanchism. So kind of idea that Russia has to be an empire, not as one that is conquering new territories, but one that is recuperating old ones. A cathexis of the state, a Freudian concept here, investment, emotional investment in the concept of great powerness, and also a theological investment in the state, in the idea of the catechonic subject that Russia is as a state. So these two combined can lead us to a conclusion that the state is simultaneously reified. So the state is now a subject, and the loyal people are an object in this discourse, and it's also deified. I am reading all these documents. I can say with 100% certainty that if there is a deity of the Russian civil religion, that is Russia itself. There's no place for Christ. And another dimension of the effective aspect of the Holy War is what in psychoanalytic terms, in Melanie Klein's concepts, is a paranoid schizoid position. So the world is split both geopolitically and axiologically. There is the West and the rest, but also these are split in themselves. So in the West, you have people that are still traditional and elites that are liberal, secularists, globalists, and whatnot. And in Russia itself, there is a splitting between the ones still resisting the Holy Rus regime in Russia, and the ones that are supporting it. So this kind of binary understanding of Russia and the world, we can define as paranoid schizoid position. And this leads to a kind of fantasy in which the restoration of Holy Rus in its fullness and purity is a kind of recovery of the lost object, something that has been harmed by the other. But also there's the underside of this fantasy is the destruction of Russia, the de-Russification that Alexander Shipkov is speaking about, or in other words, annihilation anxiety. And last but not least, the function of Ukraine here is very special. It is simultaneously a figure, an image that acts as a mother of all Russian cities, giving birth to the Russian civilization, kind of theonic, motherly function, and also Kiev as a signifier of continuity and power, of ontological security, without which Russia would be castrated. So this is the phallic function of Ukraine in this whole discourse. And my argument here is that this kind of phantasmatic discourse sustains not only the ideology within the regime, but also the unity between the political elite and the ecclesiastical elite. So this is very, very important dimension, and I don't take it as pure propaganda and slogans, but as something that indeed people identify with. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Božidar, for this exciting presentation. We don't have time for question, but I will just ask one question. I find this affective dimension the most interesting. And my question to you, from the perspective of the approach that you use, do you think that this affective side, I mean, what Freud called the economical aspect, yes, when we invest energy in something, do you think that this energy can be exhausted? Because I think it could be a possible outcome that just this effective energy that is invested is just exhausted, or what happens with it? Can it be exhausted, or?
Yes, definitely. Thank you for this question. If I build on the paranoid schizoid position, which is just another way to say manic depression kind of symptomology, now we have a Russian elite, ecclesiastical and political, that it's in mania, yes? And what follows mania is usually depression, the exhaustion of this energy and a complete block. So I'm expecting a depressive episode after this very exhausting manic episode. And I'm not trying to psychologize here. I mean, these are metaphors that I use for analytic purposes. This has little to do with, psychology itself, but I think it's a useful conceptual apparatus to think about Russian ideology and discourse.
Thank you very much. And we have our final presentation today, and we will expand a little bit our section for like 15 minutes to give Christina time to present and to answer questions. So our final presentation today will be by Professor Kristina Stöckel. Professor Kristina Stöckel, she's professor of Luis University of Rome. She has published widely on the topics of sociology of religion, political sociology, political theory, with a focus on politics and religion, on state-religion relations in Russia, norm and anti-gender mobilizations, and transnational religious actors. Her most recent book is the book The Global Fight Against LGBTI Rights, which was published in 2024, co-authored with Philip Ayub, and also the book The Moralist International, Russia in the Global Culture Wars, that was published in 2022. And Kristina will bring perspective from another angle, from the angle of Ukraine. She will talk about different identities of different churches in Ukraine, and her presentation is called Materializing Difference, the affirmation of two rival Orthodox Church identities in Ukraine through liturgy, language, and calendar. So, Kristina, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Dimitri, for this introduction. And I mean, the book you mentioned, of course, is also your book. And I'm really, happy to be here at this conference, which is only virtual, but it's still a kind of reunion of many of us working on the Russian Orthodox Church. And I will not be speaking today about the Russian Orthodox Church and the war. I have to admit that with the outbreak of this full-scale war in 2022, I've spoken a lot about it. There's been a lot of interest outside academia in trying to understand why Patriarch Kirill took the stance he took. So both in Austria and then also in Italy. So this in a way has been positive. It has shown us that our expertise is kind of looked for, but of course the whole situation is really dismal. And now being in Italy, not being able to go back to Russia in this moment, I also feel that there's very little new that can really be said, at least for me. And so also for this reason, I haven't actually now recently published or tried to do original research on the situation inside Russia. And so I appreciated a lot listening to some of your presentations. I also apologize for being late because I was teaching. Now, I've shared the screen. The paper I will present is a paper that I wrote for a special issue that will be edited by Gregorio Petizza and Jocelyn Cesari. And these are two IR scholars. And they asked me to write about material religion. So the perspective of religious materiality, a perspective on practices, lived religion, religious objects, in order to establish this in IR, in international relations theory. Because in international relations and religion, which is a field, religions are usually studied either as ideas, so soft power or ideas, or as actors, so it's churches. And then people may study the Vatican, for example, or Vatican diplomacy. So what these two authors say is they say, okay, but in IR, we actually never talk about material religions or concrete religious objects, practices, languages, and so on. And clearly this is very important in all religions. So as they invited me to talk about that in the context of Orthodox Christianity, I first thought about doing a comparison between the Russian Orthodox situation and Orthodoxy in Ukraine. But then as I started to work on it, I realized that actually the situation inside Ukraine is really interesting in terms of material religion. And so the starting point is, of course, well known to you. So we have two rival Orthodox churches inside Ukraine, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine that received autocephaly with the Tomos from the Ecumenical Patriarchate in 2018, and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which is, until 2022 was a part of the Moscow Patriarchate, or at least was oriented to the Moscow Patriarchate. And then in 2022, in May, a couple of months after the invasion, declared itself independent, not using the term autocephaly. And in Ukraine today, there are these two rival ecclesiastical structures, and it's actually even clearer how rival they are if you consider that both of these metropolitans, Metropolitan Onufri and Metropolitan Epiphany, they actually use the same clerical title. They are the Metropolitan of Kiev and all Ukraine. Now, you're also aware that this summer, the Ukrainian government passed a law 3894, that allows the government to legally ban religious organizations led from countries that have attacked Ukraine. Now, the law doesn't specifically mention Orthodox Christianity, but it's evident that the main target of this law is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which is suspected of maintaining ties with the Patriarchate of Moscow and the Russian Orthodox Church. So there's basically the suspicion that everything related to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is like an arm, a hidden arm of Moscow inside Ukraine. It's also clear that this new law has the potential to infringe on the religious freedom of believers in Ukraine, and that it creates a pressure of Ukrainian Orthodox to, well, first of all, to declare a religious belonging to one of these two ecclesiastical entities, or to shift. Probably many of you also know the research by Catherine Warner, which is about the time before the war, where she created this category of the just Orthodox, by which she meant people who would just answer they're Orthodox without really making clear to which jurisdiction they belong. So now we are in a situation with the war where the pressure to declare jurisdiction and jurisdictional belonging has become much stronger. What Law 3894 definitely does is that it reinforces a binary between a Ukrainian religious identity, which is identified with the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, and a Russian religious identity allegedly still at work at the inside the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And so in the article, I try to look at this a bit in more detail, and also developing an alternative perspective. And I look at how liturgical practices and language, objects, and church calendar contribute to establishing the Orthodox churches in Ukraine as separate realities. And I ask whether these separate realities can be categorized in the simple binary Ukrainian versus Russian, as the law pertains to do, or whether there are not more complex processes of differentiation at play, which is really a triangular differentiation of the two Orthodox churches in Ukraine vis-à-vis each other, and of both of them vis-à-vis the Russian Orthodox Church. And I make this argument looking at material aspects, and I'll now go through the examples of this. So the first example I choose and look at is the Holy Chrism. So this is an oil that is used in a liturgical context. And the reason why I became aware of it is that this Holy Chrism is actually mentioned in the expert report that became the basis for the law. Because what is the story? So the Holy Chrism is used in the Orthodox churches in specific rites. It is not produced by all churches, but it is usually produced, well, it's not even produced by all patriarchates. So in the Tomos that the Orthodox Church of Ukraine received in 2018, it is defined that the Holy Chrism will be produced by the Ecumenical Patriarchate in Constantinople and will then be sent to Ukraine as a sign that this church is a daughter of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. In a similar way, until 2022, Moscow would produce the Holy Chrism and send it to Kiev. In 2022, with this declaration of independence, it actually appears that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church has started to produce the Chrism itself, saying that it has done that in the past, in the time of the Kievan Rus. The expert report disputes that view. It says only producing the Holy Chrism itself is not enough a sign of independence. The church, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church itself, however, it is used as a proof of we are actually independent. So I think it's an interesting example in a way, because for the church, and for the church hierarchs, this is a very important part in a way of their construction of an independent ecclesiastical identity. But of course, for the believers, it's not transparent. I mean, they don't know about the process. They don't know where the Holy Chrism comes from. They actually hardly ever come in touch with it, because it's really only very rarely used in the religious context. The second object I looked at were antimensia. And maybe now I should say a word about the method I looked at. I said, I mean, the problem is that this kind of research question would really require fieldwork in Ukraine, and I wasn't able to do that. So what I did is I did interviews. I sent basically questions per emails to a few priests. It wasn't many, in Ukraine, asking them about the chrism and the antimensia. And so I had these returns. I also talked to some experts, and that's basically the data I could use. I don't have really a host of original data, but the story of the antimensia is nonetheless very interesting. This is an altar cloth, and it is a cloth that is used in order to be able to celebrate the Eucharist. And the cloth is always signed and imprinted by the metropolitan who is sort of in charge and who enables the priest. It's a bit like a license, enables the priest to serve. And it also contains a relic. And now, of course, in the context of Ukraine, where many churches actually switched jurisdiction, the question is, what happens with the antimension? Is it actually replaced? And in fact, yes. So in every church changes jurisdiction, the antimension is replaced. And in the little return I had to my questions, I also was told that sometimes these switches of jurisdiction are contested. And so the priest, in order to avoid that antimension goes to the wrong hands, actually takes this cloth with him home and brings it back to the church each time to in a way protect it. Now the question, it's very clear in a way in the case of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine that they would remove and get new antimensions. In fact, they got all new antimensions. What happens in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church? And here we were told that also there the antimensions have been removed in part. The ones signed by Volodymyr, so there would be new ones now signed by Onufry. Some people said that no, maybe the ones by Volodymyr are still around, but if they were signed by earlier metropolitans, or maybe even we have someone with an antimension signed by Patriarch Kirill, that's no longer going to be used. So, and again, this is an interesting example because it's not transparent to the believer. Believers usually don't, people participating in the mass don't see the cloth at all. But also again, from a perspective of the hierarchs of the ecclesiastical institution, it is a very relevant piece of construction of an independent church identity. Then there are 2 points which are, I think, more evident, and it's also clearer that this has a relevance for the believers. It's the liturgical language and the liturgical calendar. For the language part, I rely a lot on the work of Nadia Kisenko, who is also listening to us. So the Orthodox Church of Ukraine has started to use Ukrainian for parish communication, but also for liturgy. But different versions of Ukrainian liturgy exist, and there's not one standard translation. And also very often chant is still used in Church Slavonic, but with a Ukrainian pronunciation. And the Ukrainian Orthodox Church continues to use Church Slavonic for liturgy, but has also switched to Ukrainian for parish communication. So this is a bit more straightforward. The liturgical calendar is also a well-known one question. The Orthodox Church of Ukraine switched the date of Christmas to 25th of December. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church remains on January 7th. And then there's the point of the calendar, so the venerable saints, the question which saints to venerate, and the desire to eliminate or discard saints that are associated with Russian imperial conquest of Ukrainian lands. And this is a key element for the construction of an independent Orthodox Church identity in Ukraine. And here it is also noticeable that the Orthodox Church of Ukraine and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church have made similar efforts in revising their canons of venerable saints to express difference from the Orthodox Church. So it's not true, as someone may, the simple binary Ukrainian, Russian would expect, that Ukrainian Orthodox Church hasn't changed anything. They've also changed, for example, in this calendar of venerable saints. Both churches no longer commemorate, for example, the 12th century commander Andrei Bogolyubsky, who was responsible for the sacking of Kiev in the 12th century. Now I come already to the conclusion. So from a material religious studies perspective, sacred objects, textiles, figures, and language and time are all part of a process of world making. And in Ukraine today, both Orthodox churches are actively engaged in the making and innovation of religious worlds that differ from the Russian world. But they do for reasons rooted in their different origin stories. Each church goes about the task differently. And it's a common perception that with the Orthodox Church under the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, under the wing of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church under the wing of the Moscow Patriarchate, the church situation in Ukraine stands for a larger fault line inside global Orthodoxy. The analysis in the article tries to show that the situation is more complex than that, and that it's not a simple binary, Constantinople, Moscow, or Ukraine, Russia, but a multi-layered and multi-sided process, at the center of which stand different versions of Orthodox Ukrainian religious identity and practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina, for this exciting presentation. And we have some time for questions. So if you want to ask questions, please.
I guess questions could be put in Zoom chat addressed to Noya Adamov, our technical moderator, marked to whom concretely it's addressed, and the discussion will continue in Zoom chat. Yes, every speaker, every presenter could write equally the answer to Zoom, addressing option to everybody. And if you agree with such proposal, I'd say, I'd propose to make a break as it was planned, and 3:30 Berlin time or set time, we could come back as we gonna have a roundtable discussion on religious sensibilities and the new perspectives, and then the presentation of a recently published monograph.